So the premise is that if you design accessibility in from the start, you get a better result more easily, which sounds obvious, but it doesn't happen very often. And I think a lot of that comes down to at least the perceived complexity of building an accessible website or web application. So I'm going to try and simplify that, come up with some easy ways of analysing any interaction that's going to be on a website at any stage of the development, not just when you've got a website at the end. To introduce myself, if this is going to work, yes. I'm Alastair Campbell, Director of Accessibility at Nemensa. I have what you might think of as a UX background, but I'm old enough to think of that as usability. It was in those days. And this is roughly how I think about web accessibility. It could be seen as usability for a particular audience who have particular technology needs. But the web standards aspect of that comes in very useful in terms of making sure you have consistency across sites in how accessibility is done. So every site doesn't do it differently. It also actually works as quite a good sort of representation of my knowledge base. So what do I mean about getting a better result? Well, the simplest example I could think of was the skip link. So skip links are for people who are using a keyboard to skip over sort of main navigation and get to the content. And often it's left quite late, left to the developer. So if we tab when we find our skip link, it's this little blue link tucked under the logo. So if you think about how skip links are used, it's used by people, not just with screen readers, but people who use the keyboard but can see the screen. So tucking this little hidden link under the logo isn't that effective. If you think about it a bit earlier, maybe get a designer involved, you can come up with something a bit more like this, where actually it meets that need, so you can see it really obviously. It's a very simple example, but it works to sort of show that principle. So how do we get thinking about it earlier? Well, a lot of people start with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Hands up who's actually read them. Wow, okay. Less than usual. My follow-up question was going to be how many people actually finished them. Then the hands will go down. I'm not going to start here. It's not that they're wrong. It's that if you start here, it sort of leads you down this technological tick box-led approach. It doesn't help you think about how people are actually going to use your website. It leads to some quite strange results. I pick an example from the physical world. So here's an example where, okay, so we've got steps, we need a ramp, or let's stick something on top. This sort of reminds me of those text sizing widgets you get. So I'm not going to start with the guidelines. Another way that people try and think about it sometimes is, how do I design for people with vision impairments? That's not quite as easy as it seems. Some people will be maybe using a screen reader, which is what you might think of. Actually, about 7 or 8 times as many people will be using a screen magnifier or zoom. And that's a very different interaction because you use a mouse very heavily instead of using the keyboard so much. It gets even more complicated. If you have a cognitive impairment, you might use actually a screen reader because it reads things out to you. It makes it easier to understand. But over the years, I've basically boiled, simmered, and reduced to 4 main interaction styles. So whenever I come across a website or a web interaction, and I think, okay, how accessible is this going to be? I run through these different styles. So keyboard only, but you can see the screen. Magnification, zoom, that sort of thing. Screen readers, it's the obvious one, but I'd always look at that after having looked at keyboard accessibility. And deafness and cognitive issues. That might seem like a strange pairing, but that's the non-technology ones. And I should have mentioned earlier, I will be putting the slides and lots of links and resources online onto the lanyard page. I think it's there already, or I will put it there immediately after this. So don't worry too much about taking notes. So to go through these 4 interactions, and we'll come up with some requirements for sort of each of these interaction styles. Keyboard only. So there's a lot of assistive technologies work as keyboard only. Possibly the most famous is maybe Stephen Hawking's. Has anyone seen how his computer works? It's very similar to switch access. So it goes through every option at a time every option, and he has one button, a switch. He presses it and it selects that option. And that sort of technology is actually becoming mainstream. It's built into iOS 7. So all you need is a Bluetooth switch, you turn it on in the settings, and it will start working. This has really brought the cost down for people as well. So here's a little demo. It's on your home screen. You can tap, you can select options, and it will show you things, sort of various actions depending on what is available. Now this equates very closely to keyboard accessibility on the web as well. So very simple things. You can open up any website and you should be able to get around with this very simple set of commands. Things like tab, shift tab to go back, enter to follow links, that sort of thing. It also equates very closely to voice input, things like drag and naturally speaking. So it's one of the simplest things, but it's so often left out. All I had to do was go through some of the top websites in the UK and come up with some examples. So just pressing tab to go through the web page. We started on the logo. I'll tab up through sign in, and then it gets to the main menu. Hopefully. There we go. And then it disappears, and then it comes back again, and then it disappears. I'm pressing tab really quickly here, and it's going through all the hidden options in those drop-down menus. And then when we get to the central area, nothing happens. We've just gone past the central area. So the visibility of focus is really important for people who can see the screen and use a keyboard-like device. And there are hundreds of them. It's devices, not people, it's thousands of people. Another example where it can actually be just completely impossible. So if I tab through TripAdvisor, you can't tab to these calendars, and they've disabled text entry as well. So you literally cannot fill it in. Happily, the BBC is a better example. And what you'll see as I tab through across the top, they leave the default Chrome outline on, Chrome in this case. So you can see where you are, and it activates the mouse overs. So as you go through, when it gets through to the main section, things which are sort of done as mouse over are activated by the keyboard as well. Also, you'll notice that you can use the carousel controls, as you might expect. What you might not notice, though, is that it actually hides all the other bits of the carousel until you use those controls, unlike the drop-down menus we saw at Zoopla. You can also use things like type ahead find. So you just press Command F, type in a link name, and you can follow that link. Again, that's very similar to how things like drag and naturally speaking will navigate a website. So another question that comes up, especially for keyboard access, is what to do if you've got a more sort of complex scripted website. And really the principles remain the same. The difference can be that you're not going to different pages. So for example, if I tab through this and go into the sort of content area, we get to that and it opens up a lightbox. And when that lightbox is opened, the keyboard focus is moved into the top of the lightbox. You're kept within that lightbox, and then you can close it again and you're back to where you were. So again, the principles are very similar. Following a link should take you somewhere. So for keyboard access, the requirements really stem from that linear interaction style. Being able to see the keyboard focus, skip links, consistent layouts, and either use standard HTML controls or make sure that you script in the access. So screen magnification, there's basically two ways of making things bigger. I use the Generate conference. So zoomed is now the default one across desktops, which basically makes all the pixels bigger. And even on desktop, that will now trigger the media queries, and if you zoom in enough, you'll get the mobile view. And then you've got magnification. That's a bit more like actually zooming in, with a magnifier. The layout stays the same, but your view of it becomes much smaller. So just to take an example from a non-responsive design, imagine that you can't see that well, and I'll help with that. So now it's not too bad, but you can't actually read a lot of the text. So if we make things bigger, now we can read it, but we've lost all the information that was over on that side. So to take another example, you might not have expected to see Microsoft, but actually the homepage makes quite a good demo. If I go through the same thing, everything is still contained. We're getting a little bit more of a sort of mobile view, but it's a bit more readable. And because of that, we can actually push it further. So now we're getting what's probably more or less the view you would expect on a mobile phone, and it's a lot clearer, it's a lot more readable. And that's on a desktop with desktop zoom. So the other method was magnification. And this works quite differently. I'm just going to use the OS X sort of magnification to zoom in. And then the interaction style is that you use your mouse to push your view around. So now, actually, we've got two types of scrolling going on. You're pushing your view around, and you've got scrolling in the web page. And if you imagine I wanted to buy a mouse, use the mouse a lot if you're using a screen magnifier, so it makes sense. Let's try and buy that. I think something happened. It's difficult to tell though, so let's have a look around, see if we can find the basket. What I hadn't realised at the beginning was that this actually had horizontal scrolling in the page as well. But even so, it's quite a difficult interaction, even if you didn't have that horizontal scrolling going on. I mean, this is a fairly well-recognised usability problem in general. John Lewis have quite a good example of how to deal with that. So I'll do the same thing again. I'm trying to buy a mouse. When I find that button, clicking on it actually shows you something at the time. So there's a reaction from the button, and very close to where you are, it adds a little thing for your basket. So you actually know what's happened. Now, another aspect of this website I sort of came across very quickly. If you imagine you wanted to get some jeans to go with your mouse, trust me on that, I'll try and pick that over from the left-hand side. And that's really hard, because of your narrow focus, anything you're trying to pick at the edge of one of these menus is quite likely to disappear. That's because of your sort of narrow view when you're mousing around. This is one of the better examples because they've introduced a little sort of delay between mousing out and it disappearing. But it's still very tricky. It's one of the interactions to watch out for. So in general, good web practices are really beneficial if you need zoom. As Jeremy Keith would probably say, this is web design, but responsive web design has really helped in that fashion, partly because you're probably already testing for it if you're doing testing with mobile phones. So, next up, screen readers. So this extends the keyboard accessibility aspect with a non-visual output. So it's not always audio. This is a Braille display. It's a Braille display with a keyboard, and it's sitting on top of a regular Windows laptop. So like the keyboard, it's a very linear interaction going through the code one at a time in source order. And this is where I find the volume is odd. So, good, that's on. So this is a very basic test page I put together just to show how it works sort of a little bit more simply.
Skip to content. Site menu with 2 items. Leaving banner landmark, entering site menu navigation landmark, 2 items interact with site menu.
So I don't know if you've heard screen readers before, but it's going through all of the content, and it's not just going through sort of links and form controls. It will go through all the content, and it will read out essentially the metadata around that content, whether that is HTML tags or whether it's specific attributes that you've put in the page.
2 items navigation. 2 items heading level 2. Site menu. List 5 items. Link. Home. Link. About us. Link. Topic. 1. Landmarks 5 items.
So you can go through a bit at a time, or if you're using things like landmarks in the page, I'll explain that in a second, this can give you sort of really simple shortcuts through to other areas of the page. These are sort of predefined, but you can name them as well. So we've got banner and things like main for the main area of content.
Banner. Site menu with 2 items navigation. Table of contents with 3 items navigation. Main. Heading level 1.
So, we skip straight there. heading level 1 is very helpful. So also the basic HTML elements like headings, lists, tables, these all really provide structure to the page.
Example page.
Allow me
Leaving
to
site
skip,
menu
for
landmark,
example,
entering main landmark. Heading level 2, an image. Heading level 1, example page.
forward or back.
Heading level 2, an image. The A tree branch covered in a clear layer of eye.
So things like alt text are obviously very important for a
The
screen
effects
reader.
of rain and winter. Heading level 2, lists. Heading level 2, tables. Where you need to know the heading in order to understand the cell.
That's my favorite definition of a data table.
Table 3 columns, 3 rows. Coffee. Column T. Column 3 of 3. Row 2 of 3 main. Alastair. Coffee. 1. Cup. Column 2 of 3. T. 0. Cups. Row 3 of 3 main. Fran. Coffee. 1.
This is a little Easter egg so I can find out when my wife has seen this presentation.
Cups. End of. Heading level 2. Tabs can be a list of links that don't go anywhere, but not when you've marked them up with way area. Landmarks tab. 1.
So the way ARIA spec is essentially an extension to HTML. It was approved this year, and it basically allows you to add attributes to your HTML that help it to sort of mimic more like desktop applications. So it uses the same APIs for things like screen readers as desktop applications do, and allows you to do things like tabs, carousels, sliders, that sort of thing. And essentially, you're adding meta information into the page.
3. Press landmarks tab. 1 of 3. Design patterns tab. 2 of 3. Using way aria in HTML tab. 3 of 3. Press using way aria in HTML with 2 items tab panel.
So we know it's got tabs, we know which one is pressed, and we can go and find that tab panel. So it really comes down to that hidden structure. HTML4 elements, some HTML5, try and use things like sections quite sparingly because they tend to get announced. And it really doesn't matter if you're creating the most dynamically scripted page in the world. The basics are still important. Using these structural elements is still important. And don't worry too much if using a screen reader is a little bit daunting. You can just use the Web Developer toolbar to highlight all of these things in the page. So it really is about that sort of metadata and making it visible for us as well. One slight word of caution, though, in terms of things like ARIA markup, is that should change dynamically as you're using it. So don't sort of trust the static view too much. So the last and maybe slightly confusing group for most people is deafness and cognitive. And this is a very wide and vaguely defined group. But I use it in terms of the people that aren't using a particular technology to help them use the website. It's about understanding. So, I mean, cognitive describes everything from dyslexia through learning difficulties to being on the autistic spectrum. I put deafness here because the issues I've seen in usability testing tend to come down to understanding language. If you were born deaf, your primary language is sign language, which has a different structure and vocabulary to English. So especially for more mature people, the education system used to be pretty terrible if you were a deaf kid. So we've had a lot of people in usability testing over at the age of 40 who have very limited understanding of English through no fault of their own. It can be a bit like navigating a website is like this sort of signage. Everything's the same, it doesn't matter. And I see a lot of people clicking seemingly random links because of that. So using plain English, trying to avoid jargon is obviously a good thing, but can you take it a step further? How much do you need to rely on language? A test I sometimes do is to Greek the text, or maybe Russian the text in this case, something I don't understand. And you can still see things like email, stocks, and where to change your language. So iconography and imagery really help. And this is a big group. It's a much bigger group than those people who use screen readers. Things like, the news stories in the middle always have an image and text to go with them for maximum understanding. One site that's taken this to quite an extreme, or at least it used to anyway, it was the Quality Care Commission, who literally have a picture for every concept on the page. Initially, I thought that was going to be a bit odd, because I know how hard it is to sort of convey understanding through that sort of iconography. But in testing with people with learning difficulties or on the autistic spectrum, it really helped. They spent more time analysing those images than I did, and they got more out of them. So I'm not suggesting everyone take this sort of easy read approach, but I would like to move the needle a little bit to encourage people to use imagery and video, especially as a supplement to text, or to even that up a little bit. So another aspect that affects people with cognitive issues, maybe more than us, is things like animation, carousels. And the next one I'm going to show, if you suffer from migraines, please close your eyes for about 20 seconds. So this will completely stop a page, completely stop somebody from using this page if they have any sort of cognitive impairment. Even an aggressive carousel that's moving quite sort of rapidly and doesn't have a pause button is going to cause an issue. And I did accidentally once give a client a migraine by showing this. Ling's quite well known. I'm not going to argue it from a UX point of view, but from an accessibility point of view, it's a slam dunk. VoiceOver crashed when I tried to open this page. So the other sort of obvious aspect of being deaf is not being able to hear, so needing things like captions. And Google's done quite a remarkable thing, which is they've automatically applied captions to every video you upload. However, if your accent isn't Californian, the results can leave something to be desired. I like this video on how to eat sushi, but if you relied on the captions, would you shake your sushi? Oops.
So I rolled it over on the side.
Yes, good.
Yeah.
To hold. Then just go this. Use snap. Yes, enough. Don't shaking.
Don't shake it.
Don't shaking. Shaking. So this is just for the men, and go and finish at the men's room. Hi, hello.
So if you couldn't hear that, what would you have taken away? Now, despite the quality, I think this is overall a good thing, mostly because Google have provided us with a really easy-to-use interface to go in and change it. They've done the hard part. They've put the timings on it. And even if you don't use YouTube, it's not such a bad way. If you upload your video privately, let it do its thing, edit the captions, and you can download the file and use it somewhere else. I didn't say that. So overall, the requirements for this group tend to be plain English, use captions, be really consistent with your terminology, and try and use imagery and video if you can. So that's the sort of 4 big questions I've tried to categorize this all into. And I've got a checklist in the notes that actually has all the WCAG 2 checkpoints up to AA categorized in this way. But these are the 4 big questions. And I do start with the keyboard first, because otherwise you tend to get stuck in the screen reader bit. So, how early can we check these? These steps which sort of incorporate wheelchair access make quite a good metaphor for thinking about accessibility from the start. Compared to our first example of the steps, it's quite a different experience. Apparently they have some safety issues in the real world, but it's still quite a good metaphor. So when we're thinking about a process, there's a multitude of processes. I'm not going to sort of try and get into that too much. But there are some activities that tend to be quite common. And whether you do this sort of in a waterfall style or whether you do sort of short sprints on things, it doesn't actually matter too much. You probably have some kind of planning phase, some kind of low fidelity sort of sketching or wireframes. Visual design might come at some point in there. And then coding and content tend to come towards the end. And something I've done is run workshops with probably about 150 developers and designers. I've asked them to tell me when they could first define or test each of the accessibility requirements. And the one that really stood out was the sort of sketching or low fidelity prototyping. That was where most of these accessibility requirements could either be defined or tested. So obviously you can't test whether something has a good heading structure, but you could mark up your wireframes to show what the heading structure is. So it's actually defined at that early stage in the process. And as you go along, by the time you get to QA, you should have actually defined or tested everything, and most of it before coding as well. So I'll give you some examples. in the sort of requirements and planning stage, Paul Boeg wrote about the responsibility assignment matrix, and we use something like this in a lot of projects as well. However, site accessibility, I would equate it much more closely to UX. Everyone is responsible for UX, and accessibility actually impacts almost all of the other lines as well. So if that person is responsible for accessibility, they're really responsible for going to everyone else and making sure they're aware of what the requirements are. Another aspect that quite often gets forgotten about at the beginning is the practical aspects for people with disabilities. So if you are the National Trust and you have lots of locations around the UK, do you actually make that, do you make the accessibility requirements of that location available on the website? There tend to be lots of practical sort of things like this when you're working with clients. Say it was for a cinema chain. Do they make their captions and audio described showings obvious on the website? A lot of them don't. So if you're working with a sort of large organisation, they probably have somebody who is dedicated to their disabled customers. So go and ask them, what are the practical aspects that we should worry about in this web project? Another way that people can scupper accessibility at the beginning is to choose things, either technology or approaches, that are going to make it really hard to make accessible. So things like, does the brand palette provide you with sufficient contrast for your colour scheme? Is that going to cause you issues? Font choice, not usually such a problem these days, but previously you might have to represent the font in imagery. Are you going to take a responsive web design approach? And if not, how are you going to sort of create a more adaptable website so people can resize things? If you've got video on the site, are you going to have you identified an accessible media player? People quite often get quite far down that road and then realise, actually we need to completely redo that because we've made the wrong choice. If you use a JavaScript and UI framework, if you use jQuery or I think Dojo is another good one from an accessibility point of view, they tend to have things like white aria built in, but a lot of them don't. So if you make that choice more early in the process, you're going to have less headaches later. And the content management system, does it talk about the authoring tool guidelines? That's a sister specification to WCAG, and that's how to create a content management system that will help you make things accessible. So contracts, you're possibly not the person who creates contracts for third parties, but what I quite often find is there's one perfunctory line in a brief that says must meet AA. However, people always ignore that. One thing I found is if you say that it's going to be tested, whether or not it is, people pay attention. So, sketches and wireframes. So this is where a lot of the sort of accessibility requirements can be tested. And thinking through our 4 questions, just on this simple homepage, what would you want to be looking out for? So, our 4 questions, to remind you. Keyboard access. The things I would want to look out for, how are we going to deal with those drop-down menus? Do you sort of get to them and click and go straight through to that page, or does it open up? Carousel controls and media player play buttons are often not keyboard accessible, so it's just one thing to make sure the developers are aware of. And things like a sort of lightbox approach, is it going to move the keyboard focus into that lightbox? Next thing, magnification. Assuming it's responsive, not too much of a problem there, apart from perhaps this lightbox. Where's that box going to appear? If it goes right up at the top, that's probably going to be out of the range of the person who's using a magnifier. So either we need to move the focus or make sure that there's some interaction down here that makes it really clear what's going on. From a screen reader point of view, carousels can be a bit like playing Frogger. So as you sort of go through the page and you get to the carousel, you get maybe halfway through, and when it changes, it throws you back up to the top of the page again. It's almost like a keyboard trap. And for the video, if it's a talking head video, it probably doesn't need an audio description, but does it have sort of accessible controls? And for cognitive and deafness, Auto-playing. A bit of a no-no, but at least put a pause button on there so people can stop it. And from the video point of view, captions as well. Does the video player have captions, and who's going to be responsible for creating them, unless you use Google? Another thing to do at this stage, just very simple sort of markup. What are you anticipating that this, how are you anticipating this page will be structured? You can do it right from this stage. What are the headings? What are lists? What are the sort of landmarks on the page? You can also define, to some extent, what your expected sort of keyboard order will be. Now, I'm not recommending you use tab index. I'm recommending that you think about the source order of the page, or at least say what you anticipate that keyboard tabbing order should be, and then either in discussion with the developer or when you hand it over, they might spot something that's going to be an issue. And you can both discuss it and come to something that's better, rather than just assuming it's going to be good. So at the visual design stage, if it is a separate stage anyway, if you have a sort of a visual design deliverable, you don't want to be changing it later. So you don't want to sort of check your website at the end and realize the color contrast isn't very good. So check it before you deliver it, basically. It's very easy. There's color contrast analyzers. This is quite an old one, but good from my point of view because it will check colors on anything you can put on screen. Another aspect is make sure that you define things like hover styles, or not hover styles, focus styles. It could be the same thing. But if you actually design in skip links, and if you specify as part of your design what the focus styles should be, that doesn't leave it to chance, or the developer, depending on your perspective. So by the time we get to implementation, there should be almost no new requirements. But the thing is, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where you actually have to start testing as well from a practical in-browser point of view. So as you build, does it work with the keyboard? Does it work with Zoom, a screen reader? And is it understandable and consistent? You can build automated testing into the process, especially if you have a sort of automated build process. There are a couple of things that will do provide you a sort of API for testing your code, and you can integrate that into your build process. However, very few, so that's just an example of a sort of success and failure on the build process. But you can only test for failure. You cannot test if something passes. So having looked at those sort of requirements, hopefully this is becoming clear, but you can prove it quite simply. No automated checker will find this problem. What we tend to do to scale a small amount of accessibility testing to a larger website is test the templates, especially at an early stage, and try and work accessibility into the sort of content creation process as well. Now, it really helps if you don't just sort of assume content, people editing content know exactly how to create accessible content. It helps if you can prevent issues. So, for example, if you're using a WYSIWYG editor, take out all of the buttons that create inline styling. Also, make sure that if you're adding in images and things, it actually either prompts or preferably requires alternative text. Something else you can do, if your content management system has like a preview, you can load a sort of custom style sheet that will show lots of errors. So the principle being, if it is wrong, make it look wrong. This was a test page I did for testing accessibility checkers. And you can just load, I'm not going to go through the CSS, but very simple things. Things like, find a paragraph which only has bold in it, and say, should that be a heading? You can find missing alt text. And the key thing to this is it's customized for your site. There are a couple of general ones from Hayden Pickering and Carl Groves that I've put links to in the notes, but it really does help if you customize it for your site based on problems that you find. And the last thing really is potentially training. So if the people adding content are very knowledgeable, that's fine. But often there are people dedicated to content that don't necessarily know about accessibility. And the best place to teach that is actually part of the CMS training. So if they're learning how to use a system, how do they use that system to make it accessible content? So it's almost lunchtime. What I want to leave you with is hopefully a simpler way of analysing interactions for accessibility. We've got our four sort of main interaction styles. And the last thing is make sure the right people know the requirements from the start of a project rather than leaving it to the end. That's my talk. Thank you very much.